Now, a child getting kidnapped is every parent's worst nightmare. South Africa has seen a rise in the number of child abductions. Rebecca Walker is a research associate at the African Center for Migration, and she's written a policy brief in terms of child trafficking in South Africa, exploring myths and realities, it's titled. She argues that a lack of data claims about the number of children who are trafficked are largely unsubstantiated, exaggerated and sensationalized. She joins us now to unpack some of her findings. A very good afternoon to you, and thank you very much for joining us. So, Rebecca, you say that currently very little is known about the nature and scope of the problem in your policy brief.
So, I mean, child trafficking and human trafficking in general is a huge topic, and obviously it raises a lot of concerns. People are very fearful about the risks of child and human trafficking. But actually, there's a huge gap between what we actually know and what we claim to know. And unfortunately, what has happened is those claims, and most of them are based on sort of exaggerated numbers and myths and a real panic about child trafficking. Those claims have come to stand in for the facts about child trafficking, which then leaves us able to claim that it's escalating and it's widespread and it's a huge problem, when actually it's far more complicated than that, and it's one piece of a much more complicated story.
Where the lack of data is concerned, generally as a continent, we're not good with data capturing. Are you suggesting then perhaps that the problem is not as big as we think it is?
Yes, basically that. But I mean, it's important to say that's the problem exists, and it's a very, very serious problem. It's not a problem we should ignore by any means. But the issue is that if we only focus on child trafficking and we focus on information that has not been backed up by data, has not been backed up by empirical evidence, then we're basically misrepresenting what the issue is. And we're also deflecting our focus from some of the other issues that exist. So, for example, in our study, which was with the ACMS, the African Centre for Migration Society, and the Centre for Child Law, what we found was that children who were on the move and crossing borders are facing far more vulnerability due to lack of documentation than actual issues around trafficking. And similarly, a lot of the organisations working up at the border, including the police, say that there is very little trafficking taking place, but there is a huge amount of risk that children face because they don't have documents, because they can't travel safely, and because there's a lot of misinformation and misrepresentation of what's actually happening.
In some of the key findings of this brief, you also mentioned that human smuggling often is enabled by state actors, and that is quite widespread, a concerning thought.
Yes, I mean, I think we need to be realistic and recognise that because there isn't a safe and clear way to cross borders into South Africa, and just to add to that, we need to note that we're not talking about masses and masses of people flooding across the borders every day. I mean, the percentage of non-nationals in South Africa is quite small. It's between 3 and 7% of the whole population. But it's very hard to cross into South Africa and access documentation or cross with documentation. So of course there's a big trade around trying to get across the border without documents, and then there's those who take who take that opportunity to exploit people in the process. And there's a lot of evidence, a lot of research that has been taking place up at the borders showing how officials, border officials, police are involved in those irregular movements and helping people cross the border.
This is quite a sinister operation as well. I mean, when you're trafficking people, one doubts that you would even register that with authorities. What of those who use other means to cross borders and who use other means to get people across?
Sorry, can you explain what you mean by that question?
So, I doubt that human traffickers would go to migration officials and give a passport of somebody. So I guess the question essentially is, do we know, in terms of the work that you have been doing, of people who cross borders and who traffic people illegally?
I mean, what we know is that smuggling is widespread. And we know very little about trafficking because there's very little data. But but it's also clear that in the absence of data, the stories that are made up, the anecdotal evidence has come to replace the facts. And of course, trafficking is by its very nature a hidden crime, so it's hard to know exactly what's taking place. But at the same time, we also have a lot of very strong empirical studies that are telling us where the real risks and vulnerabilities lie, and that lies with non-nationals not being able to access documentation and therefore being open to exploitation, with children's experiences not being understood as complicated. They're not these single stories of children being put in a box and transported. Trafficking as a horrific crime exists, but if we start to use the trafficking label for all these other forms of movement, what we do is not only exaggerate the actual scale of trafficking, but we also we miss what's really happening on our doorsteps.
Sure. You also found that unsubstantiated claims about child trafficking are being used to justify repressive policies and practices which co-opt the language of protection while violating the rights of children, especially migrant children.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the prime examples there is if we talk about when the government brought in the policy around children needing to carry unabridged birth certificates to cross borders, and although that they've now removed that policy, you know, that was brought in on the basis of a claim around child trafficking, and they actually used a figure of 30,000 children being trafficked annually, which did not have any empirical basis. They couldn't say what the source of that claim, but that was done in the name of child protection, but actually did nothing to actually address trafficking, and, you know, created a huge expense, a huge mess in crossing borders, huge complications for those who travel regularly across borders. So what we find is often the governments are claiming child trafficking because it's an easy issue to focus on, because nobody wants children to be at risk, nobody wants children to suffer. But actually, it's a far more complicated issue, and dealing with those complexities is far harder. So, you know, one of the key messages in our study is that we actually, of course, we need to focus on child trafficking, but we actually need to look at it as entangled with these much bigger issues around immigration and around xenophobia and around the way in which the government is increasingly looking to tighten the borders and restrict migration, but using these arguments around trafficking, which are just unfounded.
Sure. Rebecca, I beg your pardon, I neglected to ask in the beginning in terms of the research that the brief is based on, what it was actually based upon.
So the research was carried out for the Centre for Child Law at the University of Pretoria, who have been dealing with a number of cases of children who have been claimed to have been trafficked. So there was a couple of cases where children had been smuggled into South Africa to meet up with their parents who were working in South Africa, but were actually intercepted by the state, and it was claimed that they had been trafficked and they were disallowed to meet with their parents. And there's been a number of similar cases. There's also been cases of children being denied access to school, being denied places at school, and the government saying that that is because they are trying to avoid trafficking, so children without documents not being able to go to school. And so the Centre for Child Law were very concerned about how and why trafficking was being used in this context, and wanted to know, have a better idea of the scale of what was going on. So our study, I worked with another researcher, Stanford Mahati, to look at, what people up at the borders were saying about trafficking, what child migrants themselves were saying about their experiences of crossing borders. And I mean, it was a very small study, so it doesn't sort of make a general claim about child trafficking. But what it does is ask for us to actually look deeper at what's going on, to see this as a complicated issue, and to not just jump to these assumptions and throw around these figures about child trafficking. And especially now when we see, for example, these fears around children going missing, this kind of easy jump to it being trafficking, when actually there's no evidence to suggest that in the slightest. And then we jump to blaming it on foreign nationals. And again, no evidence to support this. So we make these very easy connections, which actually take us away from dealing with the real issues.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us. Dr. Rebecca Walker is a research associate at the African Center for Migration.